la ponencia de Alison Stones sobre los milagros de Pistoia, los milagros de arte y milagros del texto de Pistoia. Alison.
What I want to do in this talk is to explore some of the unexplained mysteries about the accounts of the cult of St. James in Santiago and in Pistoia, and the links between the two places. What I have to say and show is largely based on the work of other scholars, most notably Lucia Gai in Pistoia and my late colleague Jean Corchales in Pittsburgh. Jean and I wrote about the Libra Sancti Jacobi manuscript C here in the Cathedral Archives at Santiago de Compostela, where I was the one who did the work, and manuscript P in the Archivio di Stato in Pistoia, Doc Vari 27, where Jean did the work. I recently made another foray to Pistoia to see if I could advance work on manuscript P, which Jean dated after 1524-30 by watermarks, and its model, the fragmentary Doc Vari 1, dating from the late 13th or early 14th century. Lucia Gai had already established that parts of Doc Vari 27 were copied directly from Doc Vari 1, and had speculated that Doc Vari 1 was most likely based in turn on a lost copy that might have been based on manuscript C, and could plausibly have come to Pistoia in the company of the relic of St. James, transmitted to Bishop Atto of Pistoia by Archbishop Diego Gelmirez of Santiago between 1138 and 1145. I had hoped to find evidence to tighten the arguments in favor of this last supposition. The paradox in all this, of course, is that the text of manuscript C, notably in Book 5 of the compilation, The Pilgrim's Guide, says that the body of St. James was intact, entire, and immovable. So our Pistoia Doc Vari 27, Doc Vari 1, and their model are forgery. We'll come back to that point. First of all, I'll show the relics and reliquaries, I hope, of St. James. There are quite a few around. In Marlow, the Church of St. Peter possesses the left hand of James, displayed, as you see, nicely wrapped up in red ribbon. This is the relic that arrived from the Holy Roman Empire with Matilda in the 12th century and was given to Reading Abbey. It came to Marlow after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. We have a finger of St. James in the Diocesan Museum in Eichstätt. Did it come from Venice? And is the reliquary 12th to 13th century? And then there's the foot reliquary, the left foot, significantly, of the 13th century, third quarter, preserved today in Namur. And then we've got the beautiful tooth reliquary, donated in, I've forgotten the date, 1323 by Geoffroy Cockatrix. The tooth is wrapped up in here. And here is our patron shown as a pilgrim himself. So what of Pistoia? Here we have two phenomena. This remarkable reliquary, and the relic is down here, made in 1407 by the Florentine goldsmith Lorenzo Ghiberti, best known for having made the baptistry doors known as the Gates of Paradise in Pisa, which was made between 1425 and 52 and has Old Testament scenes on it. And then we've got and here's another view. This is where it is in the chapel at Pistoia and off the right of the south aisle. This is a photograph by me, and you can see that it's juxtaposed with the altar and reredos, which are the other major manifestation of Jamesian iconography in Pistoia. Let's just take a quick look at the relic. And there's more to be said about the date of the inscription, the authenticating inscription. As you see, it's again wrapped up in red and sealed with sealing wax as part of the authenticating process. And then, in addition to that, in Pistoia, we have, and actually, I won't bother with the comparison since time is short, the splendid altarpiece and frontal dating from 1286 to the 15th century, with on the upper part the splendid frontal portrait of St. James. And this is important because he's positioned as though he were Christ. We know it's not Christ, of course, because of the iconography of the figure with his pilgrim staff and bag, holding a book, and wearing a sun hat, not a halo. So this is definitely not Christ, it's James. And underneath we have the altar frontal with scenes from the life of St. James, and I'll just show a detail of the stone boat, a subject dear to my heart. So unlikely is the narration. Here's the relic, the body of James, surrounded by rather more companions than the text give credit for, on their way to Santiago. So there's lots going on in Pistoia. The trouble is that the dates are all wrong. This is a century later. What happened to the relics between 1145 and 1287? Well, we don't know. They're mentioned in Doc Vari 1, and I'll come back to Doc Vari 1 in a moment, and you can see that that's probably the earliest record of information. But before we look at that, let's look at C, and the problems that I had hoped might be soluble by comparison with Pistoia. And I have to say right from the start that it didn't work out. I didn't find anything that would help me explain the very many problems that the Codex Calixtinus, rather Jacobus, the Jacobus version, presents. It's a question of the recopying of many of the pages in the manuscript for reasons that we really are completely in the dark about. We don't know why the text was recopied, and we don't even know exactly when. So I'll just run through quickly what the problem is. This is Book 1, which contains the liturgy of the major feasts of our hero James, allegedly written by Pope Calixtus II, and of course it isn't true. Starting with a portrait of James, and again, this is a frontal portrait. He's wearing a blue halo without a cross in it. It's definitely not Christ, but the type of figure is a type of Christ. And we're dealing here with the same illuminator and decorator. But there are other artists that take part in Book 1. This is a very peculiar foliage initial with a little figure inside, and I think this is another participant. This is the Veneranda Dies sermon opening, which Manuel Noya Santos talked about. The scribe, I believe, is the same scribe as the rest of Book 1, and we're back to our major decorator. My software tends to make me move around. Sorry about that. If I can just get back to where we were, that would be a good idea. There we go. There's lots more in Book 1 to talk about. I will pass over the music. Unfortunately, Susan Rankin didn't come in the end. The music chants for the feasts of James are included in Book 1. There's a level of minor decoration which is very well worth looking at as well, and you see some of the colored initials here that represent that, and I don't know why we're dotting around like this. Okay. There's an added half leaf with the feasts for the October feast of James added here, and there's a different decorator taking part in that. But by and large, the work done in Book 1 is pretty consistent and fairly coherent, perhaps more than one artist for the major initials, and a great deal of consistency in the scribal work and the decoration otherwise. When we turn to Book 2, the miracles, things start to change. We have, again, the same decorator and illuminator for parts of Book 2, but then suddenly there's the intervention of another scribe and decorator. As you can see, this initial here is completely different from the one adjacent to it, and why and how and so forth did this change occur. I've argued elsewhere that perhaps the participation of Hand 2 had something to do with the visit to Santiago by Arnauld de Mont, monk of Ripoll, who says that he visited Santiago because he'd heard that the liturgy was very well performed, and he wanted to take a copy back to Ripoll so that the monks of Ripoll could also sing the improved liturgy that he had heard about in Compostela. This happened in 1173, and we have, of course, the Ripoll manuscript. Perhaps the recopying in manuscript C had something to do with that visit. The date is about right, but I have no proof that that is the explanation. Scribe 2 in Book 2 continues to the end of the book, and the beginning of Book 3 is also by the same second scribe. Here are some couple of initials from it, beautifully executed in pen, in red and blue, or blue and red, depending. But in Book 3, the translation, we revert in part to the work of Scribe 1. And here on the left, we have the verso written by Scribe 2, facing a page by Scribe 1. And the book is very closely bound, so it's tricky to see into the gutter. Sometimes these changes occur not just in the middle of a sentence, but in the middle of a word. And that is pretty extraordinary. And again, I don't have any explanation as to why and how and what explains this phenomenon. At the end of Book 3, here's the end, we move straight to the appearance of St. James to Charlemagne, who got painted out in 1966 when this page was restored at the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid. A misunderstanding of the iconography, followed again by the famous and somewhat puzzling picture of the knights and Charlemagne and the knights setting out, and then this funny scene here about what they are talking about as they return to Aachen. Very odd altogether. With Book 4, we're into even more complicated setup for the scribal situation. Opening here with the Historia Turpini done in the 16th century when the manuscript was integrated into the Codex, having been removed. A beautiful historiated initial with Archbishop Turpin, the supposed author of the text, sitting again in a pose very much reminiscent of Christ. We're back to Hand 1 with all this, both Decorator 1 and Scribe 1. Gorgeous foliage initials, typical of the manuscript as a whole. And if I can just get out of here again, we'll be in business. Good. And when we switch to Scribe 2 in Book 4, you can see here the folios it's all mixed up. There's a funny initial here for which I have absolutely no explanation. In some ways, it looks like a modern forgery, and perhaps that's what it is. But the scribe is certainly scribe 2, and there's no problem with that. Suddenly, we've got a fourth scribe, and I'll come back to scribe number 3 in a moment. He must date from the 14th century, and that's quite different again. As you can see, the colors in my images depend as to whether the photographs were taken directly off the manuscript or off the facsimile. Sorry about that. The fourth scribe dates from the 14th century. He does the capital letters with a double vertical stroke. You can see it here and here. He likes to space out the names of Carolus and Rolandus here. He only does one by folio. And then we come on to the participation of scribe number 3. After scribe 4, we go back to scribe 2, and you see how he's spacing out his text here to fill up the page. And that suggests that he's copying from a previous version. There's no break in the text in all these juxtapositions of scribal hands, so that just adds to the puzzle. And it's not just outer bifolios that got messed up and had to be recopied. It's much more complicated than that. And Diathides looked into this too and produced analysis of the quires. Mostly they're quires of 8, and the facsimile, the relatively recent facsimile, takes no account of that. So you can't use the facsimile's structure to arrive at the original quiring. Here's scribe number 3, and I would date him to the probably late 13th century. And what's distinctive about him is his, I assume it's male, not female, of course, his decorated letters, and if I could just manage to pull them up better, sorry about that. It's the passage about the liberal arts, and many of the pseudo-Turpin copies omit the liberal arts altogether. So it's interesting that this section in manuscript C is done by this scribe who does not appear anywhere else in the manuscript. Suggesting that the interest in the liberal arts is a phenomenon outside of the normal run-of-the-mill pseudo-Turpin manuscripts. When we turn to Book 5, the Pilgrim's Guide, we're back again to scribe number 1 for the beginning, and this is the 16th century titulus redone. Scribe 1 is the major scribe, but we also have a participation here, for instance, by scribe 2, who does really gorgeous work. And this is the initial for Saint Eutropius, whose legend is based on that of Martial of Limoges, claiming in the Pilgrim's Guide text that he was an apostle of Christ, a transposition from Martial to Eutropius that suggests a deliberate exclusion of the Martial legend altogether. This initial is larger than most of the others, suggesting that the importance of this section of the text was considered quite great on the part of the author, or the scribe and or the decorator for no doubt political reasons. And then after that, we're back to scribe number 1. Again, this is scribe 2. And here we have a break in the middle of a word. On the left, we've got on the verso, it's hand 2. And then up here, it's hand 1. And it's sumitatem. So we've got this SU with the abbreviation, by Scribe 2 and the Mitatem by Scribe 1. This is all extremely puzzling and just adds to the complexity of the recopying process. And then we end up with back to hand 1, who finishes up to the end of book 5, followed by an appendix of music and other texts, which are important in dating the manuscript. Indeed, the dating of the 5 books, book 1 between 1130 and 1140, most likely. Book 2, the 22 Miracles of James, after 1135 and before 1139. Dated miracles cluster in the period 1080 from miracle 4 to 1110 for miracle 15. Miracle 13 relates an event of 1135, and these miracles, interesting, are all copied by Scribe. For Diathidiath, it's Scribe 1b. For me, it's just Scribe 1. The first of the miracles at the end of the Codex, in the editions at the end, copied by another hand altogether, is dated 1139. So for book 2, it's after 1135 and before 1139. Otherwise, that miracle would have simply been added in its correct chronological place. For book 3, the translation of the relics, we've got after 1120, on folios 161 to 2, the description of the procession at Santiago in chapter 3 was composed after the institution of 72 canons by Archbishop Diego Gilmirth in 1120, and the passage copied again by hand 1. Book 4, very complicated altogether. After 1130 and before 1135, question mark. Scribe 2 is the mention of the remission of sins for the contributors to Saint-Denis Building Fund, and that must reflect Suger's rebuilding of the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris between 1137 and 1144. And then we've got Book 5, the Pilgrim's Guide, after 1137. Most likely there's a synchronism in the text that includes the death of Louis VI, King of France, in 1137. So, I had hoped there might be some parallels to be found in the Pistoia manuscripts, especially Doc Vari 1, for all this. But that, alas, was not to be. I didn't find a damn thing. But I had a great time in Pistoia. I highly recommend it. And let's take a look. Here's Scribe 2 in manuscript C, and here's Doc Vari 1, the earlier of the 2 Pistoia manuscripts that contain bits of the Codex Calixtinus. And we're here in Book 3, Chapter 1. As you can see, the text is the same, Post Salvatoris, Nostri Passione, with a very interesting little, rather simple initial P. How does it relate chronologically to the one in Santiago? More or less similar in date, late 12th century, I would say, but it's not. It doesn't reach the same level of sophistication, I would say. So it's not. In other words, I had hoped that initial would be related in some way to what we see in the Codex Calixtinus, but alas, that turned out not to at all be the case. It didn't work, in other words. So, pity, great pity. However, what I have next is a bunch of parallels that indicate quite clearly that Doc Vari 1 was the model for Doc Vari 27, which is dated to the 16th century by watermarks. Here's the account of the transfer of the relics from Santiago to Pistoia, thanks to the intermediary of Cardinal Rainario here. This is a letter from sent by the Bishop of Pistoia through the intermediary, or is it the other way around? Just a second here. Okay. Epistola missa Pistoriensis Episcopo a Rainario Cardinali. Who is Rainario? Well, he's a very interesting character, and Doc Vari 1 and Doc Vari 27 tell us a great deal about him. He's otherwise, he's known as Rainarius, otherwise simply as R, and sometimes in the documents, R is expanded in error for Rainarius to Robertus. So we've got the correspondence between Diego and Atto in Doc Vari 1 and Doc Vari 27. The project was apparently initiated by Rainarius in the manuscripts. He's described as a canon of Pistoia who had studied in Paris, where he became a magister, and at Winchester in England, as P's account says, under Matthew, deacon and cardinal of St. George. Then Rainarius went to Compostela, where he became the schoolmaster and a canon of the cathedral. The Pistoia manuscripts also refer to him as a cardinal, although they do not specify in the text whether he was a cardinal of Rome or of Santiago. A marginal gloss says Cardinal of Santiago, and we've got that in Doc Vari 27 here. Then Rainarius went to, I've said that, became the schoolmaster and canon of the cathedral. The backgrounds of all three of these people, Matthew, Atto, and Rainarius, are important in tracing how Pistoia came to acquire its Jacobean relic and a version of the Codex Calixtinus. Matthew is described as a monk of Cluny, then Bishop of Albano in 1125, and papal legate in Normandy and Germany in 1128. He began his career as a priest at Reims, then became a Cluniac at Saint-Martin-des-Champs in Paris in 1108. He became prior there in 1117 and was called in by his close friend Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny, in 1122 to reform the abbey after the troubles caused by the checkered last years of Abbot Pontius. Backed by King Henry I of England, Matthew was the chief organizer of the Reforming Council of Rouen, held in September 1128. Matthew can also be traced in signatures to documents issued at Troyes, Reims, and Rouen in 1128. He witnessed occasional documents for King Henry I when the court was in Normandy. He was back in Italy by 1130, in time to become influential in the disputed election of Pope Innocent II. On his return, he wrote a rebuke to the abbots of the province of Reims about their reforming chapters of 1131 and 1132, and he died in 1134, was later raised to the rank of blessed with a feast on the 25th of December, not a very auspicious date. Depending on his own age, Rainarius might have known Matthew of Albano in Paris. Through Matthew, Rainarius may well have had connections at Cluny, the first place listed in the colophon of manuscript C, which says where the book was written, as well as in England. He could have been in England or in contact with the English royal court when Henry I's daughter, the widowed Matilda, returned from Germany with the relic of the hand of St. James, the one we've just seen, from the imperial German treasury. Henry I deposited it in his new Cluniac foundation at Reading, where I've said, where he and his second wife, Pope Calixtus's niece, Adeliza of Louvain, were later buried. After Henry's death in 1135, the relic seems to have been, this is the hand, seems to have been in the custody of that avid collector of artifacts and antiquities, Henry of Blois, abbot of Glastonbury and brother of King Stephen, until it was restored to Reading in 1156. Depending on when Rainarius was at Winchester, he may also have seen the hand relic there. Circumstances such as these might have inspired Rainarius to seek a similar relic for Pistoia. In 1133, Cardinal Matthew was influential in having the Abbot General of the Reformed Benedictine Order of Vallambrosa, Atto, chosen as Bishop of Pistoia. The correspondence about the translation of the relic of St. James to Pistoia was assembled, according to Doc Vari 27, by one Cantarinus Clericus, who is independently documented as a chancellor in Pisa in 1140 to 47. He also wrote a manuscript that's preserved in the cathedral archives there in Pistoia. The 12th century account of the relic transfer, allegedly assembled by Cantarinus, is now lost, but the correspondence and the account of the arrival of the relic are preserved, both in the 16th century copy, manuscript P, Doc Vari 27, and also in the surviving section of the 13th century copy, now Pistoia Archivio di Stato, Doc Vari 1. That manuscript, in fact, both of them also include parts of the Codex Calixtinus. Spot collations indicate that Doc Vari 27 is a faithful copy of Doc Vari 1. And one can see that here in this section and many other sections. One can do a whole bunch of comparisons. Here's one that's perhaps less easy to follow. Gloriosissimis tuis meritis divina, and that can be found here. Gloriosissimis, it helps if you know what it says in Doc Vari 27, otherwise it's extremely difficult to read. Tuis meritis divina, can just about make out the same words. It is attractive to suppose that Doc Vari 1, manuscript on the left, is itself a copy of a 12th century exemplar sent to Pisa when the chapel was built to house the newly acquired relic of St. James. It was dedicated on July the 25th, 1144. The surviving sources for the acquisition of the Pistoia relic are mostly late, and the altar shrine and the that we've seen and the splendid 15th century reliquary are much, much later than all of this. So how do we know it wasn't all a forgery? Well, because there's a papal bull in Doc Vari and 1 and 27, and here it is. The bull seems to be authentic, in which case that gives credence to the whole story. Eugenius Episcopus Sever Sevorum Dei, and so forth. And it goes on to talk about this is the institution of an indulgence for people who venerate the relic of St. James in Pistoia. So there we go. Signed in Viterbo. And then we move straight into the miracles of the relic as they occurred on the way and in Pistoia. And these are not just the relics, the miracles of St. James in Book 2. These are special miracles performed by the Pistoia relic itself. Here's the Doc Vari 27's version of the bull, same thing. Starting off with Eugenius, Episcopus Sever Sevorum Dei, etc., and on it goes. And here's somebody is drawing attention to Atto, and so forth. what's really fun is that in the correspondence with Rainarius, he tells Bishop Atto all about the real difficulties he had getting hold of the relic in Compostela, and the problems he had transporting it all the way to Pistoia. He goes on to state that the relic should be welcomed with a procession, and the letter from Archbishop Diego and the canons of Compostela reporting that he's given to Magistrum Robertum Dominum Vestre Ecclesiae Filium de Reliquis Corporis Beatissimi Jacobi Apostoli quas accepit a nobis cum summa difficultate, and so forth and so on. And so the correspondence goes on. There are many letters back and forth between Atto and Diego and Rainarius himself. The compilation in Doc Vari 1 is not complete, but it ends with a brief account of the building of the chapel for the relic and its dedication in 1145, or perhaps it was 1144. The letter from Pope Eugenius, which I've just shown you, grants indulgences of 7 days to those pilgrims traveling to the shrine of St. James at Pistoia, since Cecci Claudi contracti et aliis diversibus langoribus debiles have already been helped. Some of Doc Vari 27's miracles were later used in the liturgy for the octaves before and after the Feast of St. James and on the feast itself. The prayers and lections for these liturgies are also preserved, without any music though, in a manuscript compiled again very late by Canon Hieronymus Andre of the Cathedral of St. Zeno at Pistoia in 1476. And I'll see if we can pull that up. Here it is. Quite awful. Dreadful level. So what remains to be done? We shall probably never know exactly how the relic transfer was effected, but assuming the bull of Pope Eugenius is authentic, it did actually happen. And the reliquaries attest that the veneration was well underway in the late 13th century and later. At all events, they attest to a remarkable aspect of the cult of James beyond the confines of Santiago. Thank you very much.